That morning, there was a strange silence in the cafe. It wasn't the calm kind of quiet you'd expect. It was the sound of fear. Everyone in the crowd dropped their voice. Because he was there, the servers and baristas moved quickly but very carefully, and the steady hum of the espresso machine was muffled. Richard Carrington was sitting at the best table by the window. His name made people all over the city feel both awe and fear. He was a rich businessman who was known not for being kind, but for having a short fuse, being cocky, and having ridiculously high standards. When he came in, it was like a dark cloud moved in and put a shadow over the whole room. Everyone knew about the times he made employees cry, put managers down in front of customers, and even made a barista quit right away after something was said about them. They had good reason to be afraid. He always asked for a double espresso with a dash of cinnamon in the morning, and the smallest mistake, like bad service or an uneven foam, would make him lose it, as if these were terrible sins that could not be forgiven. In that cafe, no one hadn't seen or heard about his famous temper fits. Richard had thrown a coffee cup to the floor one time because the water was too hot for him. The young bartender ran into the back room crying and never came back. He was known for firing people right away, no matter what their situation was, or how much they begged for forgiveness. Another time when John Miller, the manager, didn't know him right away when he walked in. Richard scolded him out loud in front of all the customers. His voice echoed through the room, making John Miller bow his head in shame, and his face turn red with anger. Who do you think keeps this joint open? If it weren't for customers like me, this sad little cafe would have closed years ago. These kinds of stories spread quickly, making Richard Carrington a person who was both admired and feared for being cruel and heartless. Staff members tightened up at the sound of his sure steps on the polished tiles, and customers squished into their seats to avoid being seen. It was the same this morning. Right on time, at 7 a.m., Richard showed up in a perfect blue suit, with his silk tie perfectly in place. He walked right into the cafe without saying hello and sat down at his usual spot, which gave him a great view of the whole place. Server sprinted over to clean it, her hands shaking as she worked to get rid of every bit of dust. More and more heavy air filled the cafe every second. It seemed like everything, even the loud espresso machine, went quiet. The staff looked at each other tensely and didn't dare speak more than a whisper. Manager John Miller stood behind the counter and rang a cloth over and over again, his eyes fixed on Richard as if he were getting ready for war. While people claimed to read newspapers or books, they had their eyes on the powerful man. There was worry over everyone. Any mistake could make Richard angry, and no one could see what would happen next. After a few minutes, the young server came back with his double espresso. His hands were shaking so hard that the china was about to break. Richard didn't thank you. He did nothing but stare at the cup, checking it for any tiny flaw. The server bowed her head and went behind the bar, making everyone in the cafe hold their breath. It was very tense when Richard slowly picked up the cup and took a small sip. Right away, his face turned darker and his sharp blue eyes went cold. A small curl in his lip didn't mean he was happy. It meant he was feeling calm before a storm, and no one was brave enough to move. Everyone waited, and the fearful silence made it hard to breathe, like prisoners waiting for their punishment. In an instant, the warm cafe turned into a cold jail with people hanging by a thread. He knew that one word from Richard Carrington could turn someone's life upside down, so he slammed the cup down with such force that it echoed through the room. He then looked up with icy anger. At that point, everyone got it. Richard Carrington, who played the Tempest, was about to hit again. Richard Carrington, the storm, started a new one, as if that little cafe had just been hit by an uncontrollable tornado. As things got more tense, everyone in the room looked at the table by the window, where Richard had just put down his coffee and heard that unsettling clink. Richard tilted his head and looked at the double espresso in front of him with a sharp eye, like a judge about to hand down a sentence, as he always asked. The dark brown liquid spun in the shiny white cup, sending soft curls of steam rising to carry the strong smell of cinnamon. But Richard's face didn't show any happiness. As he looked at the coffee again, his eyes became cold, and he frowned. A great espresso was what I asked for. Rich's voice was very clear and cold. Each word was spoken slowly and clearly so that everyone could hear. Perfect means that there is nothing missing or too much, and it's neither too hot nor too cold. Alex Bennett, a 19-year-old barista who had served Richard, felt his shoulders shake right away.
Alex
had only worked at the coffee shop for a month. He looked weak because he was soft-looking, had pale skin, and big brown eyes. Alex quickly bowed his head, his glasses slipping down his nose as beads of sweat appeared. He grabbed the edge of the counter to keep himself steady and went over every step of his preparation again and again, measuring the water and coffee grounds precisely and checking the temperature twice. But Richard's cold, threatening look made him start to question himself. Richard didn't need to wait any longer. He picked up the cup one last time and looked it over carefully. Then, all of a sudden, he threw it hard onto the table. No one was ready for the crash, which shook the cafe like a gunshot. Richard yelled, "This coffee is an insult." His voice was harsh and angry. "It's too hot, unbalanced. What do you think? I come here to drink this mediocre swill." Other patrons ducked their heads, avoiding his gaze as if his look alone could make them the next victim. Fear permeated every breath. Everyone knew confronting Richard Carrington was like facing an enraged beast. Manager John Miller rushed over, striving for calm, even as his hidden hand shook violently. He bowed his head and spoke in a trembling, but measured voice. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Carrington. We'll make you another cup right away." Richard raised an eyebrow at John, contempt plain on his face. His steely eyes seemed to squeeze the manager with helplessness. Rising slowly, he surveyed the cafe and spat out another cup. "How many times have you said that? I wouldn't waste my time on such incompetence if bosses like you did your jobs right." His tone didn't say anything back, so John could only hang his head and give up. In his 40s, John Miller had a soft face and glasses perched on his nose. He was known for being patient. He had been running this cafe for 8 years and had seen many problems come up. But he was always worn out and embarrassed when he had to face Richard Carrington because he had to take insults without being able to defend himself. "You know," Richard Miller said next, his voice falling just enough to sound threatening. John's face turned pale at the direct threat. "I could wipe this cafe off the map in a week. You'd all be out of work, and you'd never find work again once I ruined your reputation." He was barely able to breathe and couldn't look Richard in the eyes. He was useless because he knew Richard could and would do what he said he would do. When Richard sat down again, his face still showed anger and pride. He gave the barista a clear signal to make his espresso again, so there would be no more mistakes. One last chance. A wonderful double espresso. Everything is perfect. "You get it?" "Yes, Mr. Carrington," John said in a soft voice as he looked quickly at Alex, whose face was burning with fear. The only thing Richard said was, "We'll do our best." He then glared out the window in anger. He knew how much power and influence he had here, and it didn't bother him that his staff felt scared or helpless. Dominance was the most important thing to him, and he would do anything to get it. Again, there was a heavy silence in the cafe. Everyone was feeling more and more afraid, and they all knew that this was just another normal day in a long line of Richard Carrington storms. In the suffocating quiet of the cafe, Richard Carrington sat back and looked out the window with a smug grin on his face. He didn't care that people's eyes were shaking as they avoided his cold stare. 19-year-old Alex Bennett was hurriedly making a second double espresso behind the bar. He was shocked and upset. Every move he made was tense, like a machine. Every drop of coffee that fell into the clean white cup was full of stress. Emily Carter, who was only 20 years old and had been working at the service desk for less than a week, saw the unfairness for the first time. It hurt so much that her heart would not stop. She had never felt so sick with fear since she walked into this cafe. Emily was skinny, had dark brown skin, and strong, determined eyes. Her naturally curly black hair was pulled back nicely, showing an oval face with strong features that showed she was always ready to stand up for what's right. However, she still had a small tray of hot cappuccinos in her hand, and her eyes were fixed on Richard. Her face was dark with worry. She grew up in poor areas of South Chicago with small streets full of racism, unfair treatment of people of color and poverty. Patricia Carter, her fierce and strong mother, had worked so hard for 20 years to raise and teach her only daughter that she was worn out. Patricia's main lesson was that no one has the right to hurt your self-respect, no matter how rich or powerful they are. Respect is not a thing that can be bought or sold. It's a basic right we're born with. Emily's heart was filled with those words, which gave her the strength to stand up to society's wrongs. Since she was a child, she knew that everyone, black or white, rich or poor, should be treated with respect and fairness. Still, what she saw made her feel crushed. Emily got angry as she saw Alex, who was also new, shake and almost cry from Richard's cruel treatment of her. She saw the beads of sweat on Alex's forehead and the hopelessness in Manager John Miller's eyes as he bowed his head and took the shame in public. Emily was furiously angry when she saw that image. Tension ran through her nerves like a tight boring. Her heart started to beat faster, and her breath got faster. She could no longer act like she didn't care or put up with this unfairness in silence, but the rule that wasn't said was clear. No one dared to go against Richard Carrington. Everyone knew that if you crossed him, you could lose your job, or even worse, have his scary power turn your whole life upside down. Everyone at work had told her over and over to keep quiet and bow her head, no matter how unreasonable his demands got. Em couldn't follow that rule. She wouldn't break the rules in respect for herself that her mother had worked so hard to teach her. She knew it would be risky to speak out, but a stronger force, an urgent call to justice, took over and pushed her fears aside. She made up her mind right away, without any doubt. Emily put the coffee tray on the table next to her and took a deep breath. Her eyes lit up with determination. She turned around and walked over to the table where Richard Carrington was sitting. Every step she took was strong and sure, even though everyone in the cafe looked at her with shock and fear. Some staff members looked at her with worry and quietly told her to stop, but she didn't listen. She looked straight at Richard, the rich and powerful man who was sitting there as if nothing could disturb his domain. He didn't know that he was about to face a real test for the first time, which made him realize how weak his control was. Emily's heart was beating faster than ever. She didn't know what would happen when she stood in front of him or how he would react to a young black woman who was brave enough to talk to him. She did know one thing, though. We'd never forgive herself if she didn't speak out today. At that very moment, the whole cafe was silent as everyone watched Emily Carter's brave steps. She was the first person in the cafe's history to break the unspoken rule and face Richard Carrington, the man everyone feared. The tension-filled silence was broken like a drum beat by Emily's soft but firm footsteps on the cafe's shiny tiled floor. The room went cold in an instant as the small black woman walked toward Richard Carrington, the most powerful man in the city. All eyes were on her. The staff wasn't moving. They stood there with wide eyes, as if they couldn't believe what was happening. Manager John Miller tried to speak up to stop her, but his throat got tight and he couldn't. He did nothing but stand there, his forehead and temples sweating as he watched the young woman walk toward the storm he feared the most. People in the crowd stopped talking, and their faces showed a mix of interest and worry. A few people whispered, but they stopped when Richard looked around the room, warned them. Emily had already reached Richard's table. She could hear her heart beating so hard in her ears. She stayed calm, though. You can't control whether your heart feels fear, but you can choose how to deal with that fear, her mother had always told her. Emily took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and turned to face Richard Carrington. She met his cold blue eyes with one steady gaze. Richard raised an eyebrow and looked up, was shocked to see a young woman standing in front of him, scowled at her, and his voice boomed with power and pride. What do you need? Emily stayed where she was and lifted her chin a little to look him in the eyes. Her voice was clear, cool, and determined. This is Emily Carter. My name is Mr. Carrington. I'm a new worker here. I need to talk to you. Richard laughed in a rude way, and the sound was filled with disdain. He leaned back and put his hands on the table. His eyes were cold and challenging. You're just a computer, but I have something to say. Why should I pay attention? Interesting. Okay, you have 30 seconds. Emily took a deep breath in. Every word she spoke was weighed down by her pride in herself and her desire to be fair. I want you to know that the way you treat the staff here is not okay at all. No matter who you are, no matter how wealthy or powerful, you have no right to insult others like this. Richard's smirk vanished instantly, his eyes widening in astonishment. In his life, no one had ever dared speak to him so directly, least of all a young server in this humble cafe. "Quite bold of you," Richard sneered, his eyes drilling into Emily like twin daggers, his voice laced with threat. "Do you even know who I am? Do you grasp the consequences of your words?" Emily did not flinch. Instead, she took a small step forward, her tone stronger and more confident. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Carrington, but that matters less than the fact that you're trampling on people's dignity. Every person in this cafe deserves respect and courtesy. Money doesn't give you the right to demean others." Her final words struck the tense air like lightning, leaving everyone in stunned silence. Richard snapped to his feet, his tall, imposing frame blotting out the sunlight streaming through the window. His face reeked with fury, and he slammed his hand on the table, his voice rising toward a roar. "What did you just say to me? You, as a server, are telling me how to behave." Emily's eyes were fearless and full of determination as she spoke, each word making a mark on the tense atmosphere. "I'm not lecturing you, Mr. Carrington. I want to tell you that no amount of money or power gives you the right to step on other people. We all deserve to be treated with respect, even simple servers like me." Richard took a short breath and looked at Emily with eyes that seemed to burn her into place. He had never met someone who didn't run away when they saw him, especially a young, quiet server he had never seen before. Time seemed to stop in the cafe at that point. People's hearts stopped beating and no one dared to breathe. A small, unknown server named Emily Carter dared to question Richard Carrington's terrifying power for the first time. She had the guts to say that human decency can't be bought or bargained away. To his surprise, Richard Carrington stared at Emily, but his surprise quickly turned to anger. He had been powerful and privileged all his life and had never been humiliated like this, especially by a young black woman who he thought had no right to question his behavior. His hand was so tight on the table edge that it turned white. He pushed down the anger that was about to burst out. Richard grew up in one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the city. His cold, unbending father taught him that strength and power should always be protected, and that the weak should always bow down to the strong. He had lived his whole life by that creed. Took a slow, steady breath in and out, trying to calm down and regain control. But his anger and pride were too strong for him to give up. Instead of going on a public rant, he chose a more vicious weapon: insults that were carefully created to target Emily's race and background. He had a thin, condescending smile on his face as his sharp blue eyes looked over her from head to toe, making people shiver. Asked in an eerie, quiet voice, "Miss Carter, is it? I've heard of people like you, those who make a show of themselves, but deep down are riddled with insecurity and doubt. I suppose you wanted to prove you're special by standing up to me, didn't you?" Emily's brow knit, but she kept quiet. He was trying to get her to get angry, and she saw through his trap and refused to take the bait. Richard kept going. His voice was smooth, but it was full of hate. "Amy, I get it. People in your situation often have terrible situations. Without a doubt, your mom worked very hard to raise you, right? She probably worked herself to the bone to teach you high-minded things like respect and justice. But face it, the world isn't as fair as you think it is. Because of who you are and the color of your skin, you'll never be able to do certain things." His cruel words echoed through the thick silence, making people very uncomfortable. Dropped their eyes because they felt ashamed to see such clear wrongdoing, but were too scared to do anything about it. Others stood there, gasping for air, as if they were seeing a fierce battle between two opposite forces. Emily did not move at all. His insults hit her like unseen blades, cutting into her heart. Even though her chest felt tight, her face stayed calm. She thought of her mother, the strong, unbreakable woman who had given up her youth to raise and protect her. Richard's words could never shatter Emily's self-worth, knew her true value in a way he never could. Mr. Carrington, Emily said. Her voice clear and unwavering, her eyes locking onto his. I understand you're trying to wound me with those prejudiced remarks, but I won't let you insult my mother or my heritage. Yes, my mother worked incredibly hard to raise me, but she also taught me something vital. Never bow to injustice or to those who use power to crush others. Richard gripped the table even tighter, his face flushed with fury. Emily pressed on, her tone stronger than ever. You're right. The world isn't always fair, but that doesn't give us the right to tolerate injustice. I'm not trying to make myself special. I'm simply doing what any decent person should do when they see someone being demeaned and oppressed. Her words rang out like thunder, shaking the entire cafe awoke. When she showed how brave she was, Richard tried to keep up his cold mask. But it was clear he was losing control. As Emily went on, I really feel sorry for you, Mr. Carrington, because you've spent your whole life thinking that being rich and powerful gives you the right to insult other people. But I promise you, money will never buy real respect. Richard stood still for a moment, his anger and confusion making him unable to speak. In that split second, Emily Carter had shaken his sense of total power, and he knew it. The air in the cafe felt heavy and charged, like every breath was being held. Everyone kept their attention on the tense fight between Emily Carter and Richard Carrington. A very intense fight for honor, self-respect, and power is taking place. I finally got out of the cafe, and the heavy glass door shut behind me like the end of a tense fight. It was quiet after that, but Emily didn't feel calm. She could feel the weight of what she had done and the looks of admiration and fear from both customers and coworkers. She slowly went back to the service counter. Even though her steps looked calm, she was feeling a lot of different emotions. At once, she could feel that everyone was looking at her, some of them interested, some quietly critical, or worried about the defense she'd put up for someone else. She knew what was being said behind her back. What does she believe she is? Putting Richard Carrington to the test. Either she doesn't know who he is, or she's just too sure of herself. I bet she gets fired soon. Emily's pride was cut like a knife by those whispers. She kept her cool and pretended not to hear, but she was deeply lonely and let down on the inside. She was brave to stand up to someone so strong and to question the deeply held biases of everyone around her. She bowed her head and focused on wiping down the counter, trying to stop her thoughts from getting in the way of her work. She wasn't sorry for what she had done, but she felt more alone than ever. She had hoped that would be thankful now, but they looked at her like she had done something terrible. Manager John Miller walked up, and his face showed that he was worried and stressed. His voice was low, but it was full of meaning. Emily, I understand that you meant well, but please think about what you're about to do, Richard Carrington. Doesn't take things lying down. I bet you're scared about yourself. She looked up at John and saw care and gentle reprimand in his eyes. After a moment's pause, she replied evenly, I understand, Mr. Miller, but I believe I did the right thing. He sighed, shook his head, and quietly walked away. Emily felt the invisible divide growing between her and everyone else in the cafe. No one dared approach her, as if merely speaking to her might land them in trouble. The rest of her shift dragged on. Emily threw herself into her work, serving each cup of coffee with as much care and dedication as she could muster. Yet the atmosphere remained heavy with cold, hesitant stares. Once the cafe had emptied, she was left alone to wipe down tables and chairs, her mind burdened by uneasy thoughts. She thought of her mother, who had sacrificed her youth to protect Emily's dignity against life's injustices. She remembered her mother's rough hands after long days' work, her unbounded spirit in the face of unfair insults. That image gave Emily strength to confront the loneliness and prejudice before her. She realized that her true fight wasn't with Richard Carrington, but with the invisible walls of class and racial bias encircling her. Those biases weren't spoken aloud, yet they separated her from everyone else. Suddenly, Alex Bennett, the young coworker she defended, approached her hesitantly. His eyes shone with gratitude and guilt. Emily, thank you so much for standing up for me. I'm sorry you had to hear those awful things. Emily offered him a gentle smile and shook her head, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Oh, you don't need to apologize. I did it because everyone deserves respect, no matter who we are or the color of our skin. Alex nodded, looking at Emily with admiration and reverence. In that moment, Emily felt some of her burden lift. She recognized that even if she faced isolation, there were still those who understood the value and meaning of what she'd done. When her shift finally ended, Emily walked home under a sunset sky painted red. As she strode along the familiar streets, she felt more keenly than ever the weight of the battle she had chosen. Yet her resolve burned brighter than her fears. She knew the path ahead would be lonely and challenging, but her dignity and self-respect were things she would never surrender, even if she had to stand alone. Emily Carter would not back down because she understood better than anyone that those who dare to stand alone against injustice are the ones who truly change the world. At the same moment, Emily stepped out of the cafe, bathed in the fiery glow of dusk, not far away, in the luxurious penthouse atop a downtown skyscraper. Richard Carrington sat alone in the dim light of his expansive living room, a glass of whiskey cradled in his hand. Normally, after each display of his absolute power over the vulnerable, he felt a deep satisfaction, as though it were the ultimate proof of the dominance he'd spent his life constructing. But tonight, that feeling eluded him. He took a slow sip, the Wisey's fiery burns sliding down his throat in an attempt to drown out the growing discomfort in his chest. His eyes drifted to the window where the city's lights below glittered like a field of distant stars. Inside, he felt hollow and profoundly alone. He couldn't stop replaying Emily's image in his mind. The young black woman with those fierce eyes and the cutting words that had so thoroughly surprised and unsettled him. Her voice still rang in his head, clear as if she'd spoken only moments ago. He couldn't fathom why the words of an ordinary girl could affect him so strongly. Richard had always prided himself on overwhelming others with his words and the power he wielded. But for the first time in many years, he found himself facing an unsettling combination of anxiety and irritation at the resilience of someone he'd dismissed. Emily's words kept echoing in his mind. Money doesn't give you the right to look down on others. He closed his eyes, willing the sensation away. But the harder he tried, the more powerless he felt. Inside him, a fierce struggle raged between his pride and an unfamiliar emotion. Shame. He hated that feeling. Told himself he couldn't be shaken by a tiny girl like Emily, yet deep down he knew that was no longer true. Rising to his feet, Richard strode to the large window, looking down at the streets below with his customary cold gaze. He convinced himself Emily was merely an exception, a momentary outburst from an inexperienced young woman, hardly worth further thought. Yet, almost instantly another part of him objected. Emily was nothing like the others. She had looked him in the eye without flinching, something no one else had ever dared. He shook his head, trying to banish the thought. He refused to lose so easily. To reclaim his confidence and reaffirm his authority, he resolved to return to the cafe tomorrow to reassert his dominance and pressure everyone there, especially Emily, until she bowed to him. The next morning, Richard entered the cafe with his usual air of arrogance, though beneath it, he felt a strange unease. He ordered more critically than ever, scrutinizing every tiny detail of his cup's preparation. But each time he raised his voice to berate a server, Emily's steady gaze flashed in his mind, causing him to hesitate and robbing his tone of its usual force. He realized that no matter how hard he denied it, something small but unmistakable was shifting within him. Felt uncomfortable with his inability to hurl insults as freely as before. Words that had once rolled off his tongue effortlessly now felt forced and stilted, and that helplessness shook him to his core. From the outside, Richard remained the richest, most fearsome man the cafe had ever known. But the truth was that his confidence was eroding, as if an invisible crack had formed in the proud wall he'd built around himself. Meanwhile, Emily continued her work with devoted professionalism, never averting her eyes when he looked her way. Her quiet strength and composure irritated him even more. Every time she served him with calm courtesy, he felt smaller, and his wounded pride burned all the brighter. Richard tried every trick he knew to convince himself Emily had no power over him. But the more he denied it, the clearer the change in himself became. His familiar words and actions now rang hollow, and that realization left him more powerless than he'd ever been. Deep inside, he understood he had finally met a true adversary, one small in stature, but rich in courage and dignity, capable of shaking to its foundations the entire value system he'd spent his life erecting, and try as he might to deny it. The crack in his arrogance had opened, and little by little, it was beginning to change him from the inside out. Over the following days, the cafe was suffused with an atmosphere more stifling than ever. Richard Carrington began showing up more frequently, and each time he was more demanding and harsh. His eye aimed squarely at Emily. The tension made the staff increasingly anxious and hesitant whenever they served him. They all sensed that Richard was intentionally ratcheting up the pressure to force Emily out in shame and helplessness. One morning, Richard strode into the cafe, his expression as cold as ice. He made a bell-line for his usual table by the window, his eyes sweeping challengingly. Over Emily at the counter, Emily felt her chest tightened with anxiety, but she maintained a calm exterior. Her gaze bright and resolute, bracing herself for a trying workday. With a forceful thud, Richard slammed his leather briefcase onto the table and summoned manager John Miller with an authoritative snap. "Miller, I need to speak with you in private today." John hurried over, his face pale with tension. Richard's voice rang out loud enough for everyone around to hear. "I think the service standards here have plummeted. I know why." "It's because of that employee," he said, nodding coldly toward Emily. Richard's cold, authoritative voice echoed through the cafe, stopping everyone in their tracks. "I want her out of this cafe right away. If she doesn't leave, I promise I will use every ounce of my power to shut this place down." Emily stood there still, her heart beating fast, but her eyes didn't move. There was no fear in her face even, though she knew things were getting out of hand. John Miller gave Emily a confused look, and then turned back to Richard with an awkward look on his face. "Good morning, Mr. Carrington. I don't believe Emily is the issue. She does a great job at work." Richard cut him off with a cold, rude, nothing look. "Okay, she was rude to me in front of everyone. Either fire her or get ready to close the cafe for good." The stress in the coffee shop reached a breaking point. Emily felt like unfairness was weighing her down, but she kept quiet and stood tall and proud. People in the store held their breath as they watched what happened. Then, out of the corner, a loud, old voice broke the oppressive quiet. "Richard, enough is enough." Everyone looked at the speaker, Henry Thompson, an old man who came here every morning for coffee. He got up slowly, but with a royal air, and he looked straight at Richard without fear. Richard moved quickly and frowned in pain. "It's not your business, Mr. Thompson." Henry Thompson smiled softly, and his voice was warm but firm. "Yes, Richard, it is. You might not remember, but you made me feel bad about myself on purpose at a work party a few years ago. I didn't say anything for too long, letting you insult and hurt people whenever you wanted." Richard stopped for a moment, clearly shocked by this sudden dare. He tried to get back in charge by raising an eyebrow. "Mr. Thompson, that happened a long time ago, and I don't think you have the right to get involved now." Henry took a step closer, and his eyes were filled with purpose. "Richard, I do have the right. I'm not going to stand by and watch you pick on an innocent woman any longer today. She showed courage by standing up to your arrogance and injustice, and I will stand with her." Henry's words were like a shaft of light cutting through the cafe's gloom. A few customers began nodding in agreement, their eyes filled with sympathy and admiration for Emily. One by one, they rose to defend the young woman, leaving Richard visibly stunned. A middle-aged woman, Mrs. Margaret Collins, spoke up firmly. "I agree with Mr. Thompson. Emily did the right thing. You cannot continue abusing your wealth and power to treat people cry." Then a young man seated near the window stood up. "Emily has done nothing wrong. It's time someone told you, Mr. Carrington, that you can't look down on people forever." Richard stood frozen, his face flushed with shame and anger. For the first time in his life, he faced public opposition from so many. He could feel his power slipping away, his usual authority no longer enough to cow those around him. Emily watched, her heart swelling with emotion and gratitude. Strangers had risen to defend her, to defend fairness and dignity, the very values she had always believed in, and fought for. Realizing he had lost control of the situation, Richard turned and stormed out of the cafe, not daring to look back. As the door swung shut behind him, the cafe erupted in tears and applause, full of joy and relief. Emily felt tears sting her eyes as she offered a heartfelt smile to everyone who had stood up for her. In that moment, she understood that, though the road ahead would still be challenging, she was not alone. The power of courage and justice had triumphed, and from this point on, nothing could make her bow her head again. As the glass door closed behind Richard Carrington, sound seemed to echo endlessly through the cafe's small space, marking the first time the city's most powerful man had retreated in utter humiliation. With each passing second, the usual, suffocating tension lifted, replaced by a newfound sense of relief and freedom. Emily stood where she was, her heart pounding with each beat. Around her, gentle applause began, and warm, supportive looks were directed her way. This was more than Emily's personal victory. It was a collective triumph for everyone who had endured oppression and stayed silent before Richard Carrington's power. Meanwhile, Richard sped away from the cafe, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles whitened, his rage unlike anything he'd ever felt. His heart pounded violently, and his breath came in quick, angry gasps. He hadn't felt so powerless in years, and it unnerved him completely. Back in his familiar, lavish penthouse, Richard entered the silent living room, shrugged off his expensive coat, and flopped onto his leather sofa, staring blankly into space. For the first time, Richard Carrington, the man who had always stood at the pinnacle of power, revered and feared, realized he had been defeated by the collective strength of those he once dismissed. The more he thought, the more unsettled he became. Emily's bold words and the customers' united defiance replayed in his mind, impossible to shake. He saw how his arrogance had built an invisible wall between himself and everyone else. People feared him, but did not respect or care for him. He rose, walked slowly to the window, and looked down at the twinkling city lights. A profound sense of isolation and loneliness seeped into his heart. For the first time, Richard understood that no matter how wealthy or powerful he might be, he could not buy genuine loyalty or affection, things he had inadvertently lost through his own behavior. Over the next days, the little cafe where Emily worked seemed reborn in an atmosphere of fresh ease and freedom. Staff no longer stiffened whenever the door opened. Customers felt comfortable chatting again, laughter ringing through the air, something rare when Richard was around. Yet most surprising of all, Richard kept coming back every morning. Only this time, he arrived with a noticeably gentler air, shedding his usual arrogance and irritation. He would sit quietly in his usual corner, sipping his espresso slowly, observing everything, especially Emily, with a thoughtful gaze. Sometimes he watched how she worked, the way she smiled at customers, and how she remained poised even in the tensest moments. A strange feeling began to stir in him, something like admiration mixed with bewilderment. Emily, the petite young black woman he once dismissed, now held his attention with her strength, sincerity, and rare dignity. One morning, as Emily placed his espresso before him, Richard found himself speaking in a soft voice that surprised even him. "Thank you, Emily." Emily paused, surprised, then offered a polite smile. "You're welcome, Mr. Carrington." That brief moment brought Richard a sense of ease he'd never known. For the first time, he realized that a single, sincere thank you, however small, could feel profoundly comforting. He wondered how many such moments he had missed throughout his life. From that day on, Richard no longer sought to make things difficult for Emily or anyone else. He maintained his stern exterior, but the tension he carried eased considerably. His change in demeanor made those around him gradually more at ease in his presence. Though he wasn't fully integrated yet, at least he was no longer the terrifying ghost that everyone had once feared. Richard also came to see that arrogance and contempt only deepened his loneliness. Something inside him had truly shifted, thanks to the courage and dignity Emily had shown. While he couldn't fully accept it just yet, her presence and actions had opened a new door for him, a door to genuine respect and compassion. And so, bit by bit, Richard Carrington, the man once thought unchangeable, quietly embarked on a new journey, one in which, for the first time, he truly sought to understand the value of respect and humanity. Over the following days, Richard Carrington's gentle yet meaningful presence at the cafe became familiar. Gone were his angry outbursts and intimidating stares. In their place was thoughtful silence, occasionally punctuated by a discreet glance in Emily's direction. Everyone who knew him noticed a subtle but surprising shift, quiet respect for the petite young woman who had once bravely stood up to his overwhelming authority. Emily, in turn, continued her work with the same calm dedication as always. Never let recent events change her humble demeanor. She still rose early each morning, entered the cafe with a genuine smile, and carried herself with joy in every small gesture. To her, speaking up for what's right was never about seeking attention or admiration. It was simply part of who she was, instilled in her by her mother through years of hardship. Although Emily never sought the spotlight, she inevitably became a symbol of courage and inner strength among her colleagues and the cafe's regulars. Her story quickly spread beyond the cafe walls, recounted as a clear testament to the power of self-respect and moral conviction. Day after day, patrons would meet her with warm, admiring eyes, as if her very presence bolstered their faith in goodness amid life's injustices. One morning, Emily was carefully wiping down tables when she noticed Richard watching her. His gaze no longer held its former threat or disdain, but conveyed curious admiration. Emily didn't turn away. She offered him a gentle smile and a polite nod, then resumed her work. Richard paused for a moment before returning her nod with a small, almost bashful tilt of his head. Though brief, the exchange was deeply significant. It marked an unspoken acknowledgement from a man who had once dismissed everyone, now learning to respect another, even if she was just an ordinary young woman in a small cafe. From that day on, Richard paid close attention to how Emily interacted with customers and coworkers. He began to notice small things he'd never before appreciated: how she quietly helped Alex whenever he faltered, how she gently comforted an elderly patron in distress, or how she remained composed during the morning rush. Each small, sincere act gradually reshaped his perception of her, and by extension of how he treated those around him. Then one afternoon, as Emily was about to leave after her shift, Richard summoned her to his table. His eyes were unexpectedly sincere. "Emily, may I ask you something?" Startled, Emily nevertheless nodded respectfully. "Of course, Mr. Carrington." He hesitated for a moment, an expression none had ever seen on his face before speaking in a soft, earnest tone. "How are you so strong? I truly don't understand." Emily looked at him for a moment, then answered gently, her eyes filled with honesty. "Maybe it's because of my mother. She taught me that real strength doesn't come from power or wealth, but from holding on to your dignity and respecting others, no matter how harsh life gets." Richard fell silent, as if absorbing her words. In his mind, a deep admiration was taking root. He began to realize that Emily's attitude was something he had long lacked. He recognized that all his wealth, power, and status had never brought him true happiness or peace, because they had always come with fear and loneliness. From that day forward, Richard did more than silently observe Emily. He began genuinely listening to her. Even if only through the brief conversations they shared over coffee, Emily's simple words became precious lessons unlike anything he'd ever encountered in his world of wealth and authority. The other staff noticed this subtle transformation in Richard as well. They greeted him with less apprehension, even feeling at ease in his presence. Most importantly, they looked at Emily with fresh respect and admiration. This young woman, through her courage and inner strength, had achieved the once impossible, prompting the city's most powerful, haughty man to reflect on himself. Emily never set out to do any of this, and yet she unknowingly became an icon, a symbol of strength, self-respect, and belief in humanity's best qualities. And Richard Carrington, for the first time in his life, willingly bowed his head to that power, a power not of money or influence, but of dignity and compassion. The more quietly Richard observed Emily, the more he recognized the genuine strength behind each of her small, thoughtful actions. One late afternoon, as the sunset painted familiar street corners gold, Richard happened upon a conversation between Emily and a regular customer at the counter. Mrs. Margaret Collins, the older woman who had once stood up to defend Emily, unintentionally. Richard found himself standing behind a large pillar near the cafe's entrance, not meaning to eavesdrop, but Emily's gentle voice drew his attention. She was telling Mrs. Collins about her mother, Patricia Carter, the woman who had raised her alone through poverty and hardship. The story of those grueling days when her mother worked 2 or 3 jobs a day, exhausted yet never surrendering her dignity, left Richard speechless. She always told me that no matter how poor we were, we must never lose our self-respect, Emily said, her voice full of pride and emotion. I saw people look down on her, but she never bowed her head or betrayed her belief in what was right. That is the most precious thing she passed on to me. Richard stood frozen, feeling as though his heart had been squeezed by a painful truth. Emily's words reached deep into his soul, the part long buried under layers of arrogance and indifference. He recalled the times he'd used his power and wealth to hurt others, just as people had once cried treated Emily's mother. Suddenly he realized something terrifying. He had been complicit in that very injustice. Memories of employees he'd fired for the smallest mistakes, of people who'd silently wept under his harsh, insulting words flashed before him, haunting reminders of his past callousness. That evening, back in his luxurious penthouse, Richard sat in darkness without turning on a light or reaching for his usual glass of whiskey. He simply faced himself in the silence, wondering how he'd become this man. A wealthy yet lonely figure, powerful yet unloved. He clearly saw that his pride and coldness, traits he'd long worn as badges of honor, had kept him isolated from everyone. Now, Emily's steadfast dignity and resilience played over and over in his mind, a stern but humane reminder of what he had lost: the ability to empathize and connect with others. He remembered Emily's proud, fearless gaze the first time she stood before him, daring to speak truths that no one else would speak. In that moment, he had been conquered by a power that money and authority could never buy: courage and sincerity. Richard rose and walked to the window, looking down on the familiar streets, now shrouded in darkness. The distant lights of the city offered no comfort. Instead, they underscored his profound isolation. He realized that the life he'd built, so seemingly complete, was in fact empty and meaningless, a direct result of how he had treated those around him. Deep in his heart, a powerful shame began to spread. He felt ashamed of Emily's courage, of the young woman who had overcome life's obstacles without losing her dignity. He felt ashamed of her mother, the brave woman who had endured so much to protect her daughter's self-respect. And he felt ashamed of himself, the man who had helped create and perpetuate societal injustice. So over the following days, Richard continued to visit the cafe, but now with an even more pensive humility. He no longer flaunted his power or sought to dominate. Every time he saw Emily at work, he felt a deep, heartfelt respect. At times, he even caught himself watching her from afar, wondering how such a small young woman could possess such strength. One morning, as Emily set his usual espresso before him, Richard looked up and quietly said, "Thank you, Emily. I really admire you." Emily paused, then returned his gaze with a sincere smile. "And I thank you, Mr. Carrington. Your daily presence here and your gentler manner have already meant so much to everyone." A gentle joy filled Richard's heart, something he hadn't felt in years. He understood that the past couldn't be undone, but the future could be rebuilt through good deeds starting now. And the young woman named Emily had unwittingly become his guide back to himself. From that moment on, Richard resolved that he would no longer be the man everyone feared. Instead, he wanted to be known as someone who truly listened, who empathized, and who honored the dignity of others. A transformation sparked by the courage and sincerity of Emily Carter. Deep reflections on his past and the harm he'd caused had gradually become an unbearable burden for Richard Carrington. Every morning as he stepped into the cafe, felt more keenly than ever the silent yet powerful change taking place within himself, one he knew he could no longer hide. One morning, as the first light filtered into every corner of the cafe, Richard entered with an unusually calm and thoughtful air. The cafe fell silent when everyone saw him head straight for the counter, where the young barista, Alex Bennett, was preparing coffee. Alex froze, his face paling in fear as Richard approached. Richard took a deep breath, looked at Alex with a transparency he had never shown before, and spoke in a gentle voice. "Alex, may I speak with you for a moment?" Alex blinked in surprise, his expression a mix of doubt and confusion, but he nodded. Slowly, "Yes, Mr. Carrington." Richard hesitated for a second, then continued in a warm, sincere tone. "I want to apologize to you, Alex, for the disrespectful words and actions I once directed at you. I know those things hurt you, and I am truly sorry." The cafe seemed to freeze at Richard's sudden apology. Alex's eyes grew wide with shock, and his face turned red from emotion and shame. Everyone there was touched when Richard put a gentle hand on Alex's shoulder and said, "Sir, I don't know what to say, but thank you for saying that. No, I should be thanking you for being patient and kind all this time. I hope you can forgive me." Alex's eyes shone, and he smiled in the most real way anyone had ever seen him smile. "I forgive you, Mr. Carrington. Thank you for saying it." The tension in the cafe melted away, replaced by a warm glow that filled the small space. But Richard wasn't finished. He turned and walked toward the center of the room where Emily was serving a table of customers, his eyes bright with determination. In honesty, Emily sensed something was different. Emily and Mr. Carrington, a story of courage and kindness, simple English Emily, placed her food tray on the table. She looked up and was surprised to see Richard standing in front of her. Everyone in the cafe stopped and watched. Richard spoke clearly and with feeling. "Emily, I treated you badly. I was rude and unfair, and that was wrong. I want to say I'm sorry for hurting you and not respecting you." Emily looked at him. Her eyes were full of emotion. "I forgave you a long time ago, Mr. Carrington," she said softly. Richard smiled. "Thank you. I used to think money and power were the most important things. But I was wrong. You showed me what really matters. Kindness, respect, and courage. I will always be thankful." The whole cafe was silent. Some older people quietly wiped away tears. Alex smiled. John Miller, who had been stressed because of Nia. Richard felt peace for the first time in years. Then the cafe cheered. Everyone stood up and clapped. Emily knew they were proud of her. She stepped closer and whispered, "I'm glad you understand now. Everyone deserves a second chance." Richard nodded, looking calm and happy. At that moment, he knew that saying sorry was not weakness. It was real strength. The kind that comes from being brave enough to admit when you're wrong. Everyone in the cafe would always remember that moment. The most powerful and feared man had bowed his head and said, sorry to a young woman with courage and self-respect. But his apology was more than just words. It started something new, a new time of respect, kindness, and healing. And the person who made this happen was Emily Carter. Emily became a symbol of strength and dignity. From the moment Richard said sorry, something beautiful began between them. Nobody expected it to. People so different slowly became close. Richard came back to the cafe often, but now he wasn't scary. He was kind and calm. He talked to the workers and asked about their lives. He listened. Every morning he sat at his usual table and ordered espresso. Millie always served him. Instead of cold looks, he gave her kind smiles. She answered with her warm heart and polite words. Their small talks about the weather or daily things felt special. They were filled with respect and care. Both of them knew they had grown. They saw each other not as rich or poor, boss or worker, but as human beings with value. Other people noticed too. The cafe staff smiled at Richard now. They were no longer afraid. Even John Miller, the manager, became friends with Richard. Richard had changed, and it was real. Richard also felt something new. He was no longer alone. For the first time, he had opened his heart to others. Emily's courage inspired the whole neighborhood. She was a small woman, but her strength was big. People came to the cafe not just for coffee, but to feel her hope and courage. Her story reminded everyone that one brave person can change many lives. Richard learned that true happiness is not in money or power, but in caring about others. He had never known that before. One morning, Richard walked in as usual. Emily brought him his espresso with a smile. "How are you today, Mr. Carrington?" Richard smiled back. "I'm very well, Emily. To be honest, I haven't felt this good in many years." "Thank you." Emily's face lit up. "It's because of you, sir. Anyone can change if they really want to." Richard nodded. His eyes were shining. "That's right. I hope our story inspires others. I want people to know that courage and kindness are stronger than power." The cafe felt warm and peaceful that morning. The people nodded and smiled. They knew they had seen something special. The message was clear. We all have the right and the duty to stand up for what is fair, to treat every person with dignity and respect. That was the gift Emily and Richard gave the world. And now, to Youtha, one reading this, remember, real strength is not in money or being the boss. Real strength is in your courage, your kindness, and your respect for others. Be brave. Stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, because the best things in life come from ordinary people who choose to do the right thing. So, we just shared the story of Emily and Mr. Carrington. One young woman stood up for what's right, and changed a powerful man's heart. Now what about you? Have you ever seen or experienced a time when someone stood up with courage? Tell us in the comments. If this story touched your heart, like it, share it, and subscribe for more stories about courage, kindness, and hope. Thank you for watching. See you next time.